Sea moss has two main claims to fame. First, it's promoted as a mineral-rich sea vegetable that's especially high in iodine and other trace minerals. Second, it's naturally rich in a soluble fiber called Carrageenan. But when you take a closer look, these benefits may not actually be benefits at all. The biggest thing that makes sea moss stand out nutritionally is its iodine content. While it does contain trace minerals, many of those same nutrients are already found in common leafy greens like spinach, kale, Swiss chard, and watercress. Nutritionally, these vegetables are actually pretty comparable to sea moss in many ways, except sea moss contains far more iodine. Because iodine naturally accumulates in seawater, most sea vegetables like kelp, nori, wakame, dulse, and sea moss are naturally high in it. Even seafood like cod, shrimp, and oysters can provide significant amounts. But the question is, do most people actually need extra iodine? In North America, iodine deficiency is relatively uncommon because iodized salt is widely used. Many people also get iodine from everyday foods like dairy products, eggs, seafood, bread, and even some canned or frozen foods. In fact, dairy products such as yogurt and cheese often contribute more iodine to the average diet than seafood does. That's partly because iodine-containing sanitizers are used in milk processing, and cattle feed is often fortified with iodine as well. So for most people who aren't pregnant or following a very restrictive vegan diet, getting enough iodine usually isn't a concern. In some cases though, too much iodine can actually become a problem. Sea moss naturally contains fairly high and, more problematically, unpredictable amounts of iodine. While moderate amounts are unlikely to affect healthy individuals, excess iodine can overstimulate the thyroid in susceptible people, especially those with underlying thyroid conditions like Graves' disease or thyroid nodules. This can trigger hyperthyroidism through something called the Jod-Basedow effect. Symptoms may include anxiety, rapid heartbeat, weight loss, fatigue, and heat intolerance. There are even documented case reports linking sea moss supplements to thyroid issues. In one report, a woman with previously undiagnosed Graves' disease experienced worsening hyperthyroidism after taking sea moss supplements, and her thyroid levels improved once she stopped taking them. The other major component of sea moss is Carrageenan, a type of soluble fiber that gives sea moss its thick, gel-like texture when mixed with water. Depending on the species and where it's harvested, dried sea moss can contain anywhere from 30% to 60% Carrageenan by weight. Carrageenan is actually very common in the food industry and is often added to products like ice creams, sauces, plant milks, and processed foods as a thickener or stabilizer. Regulatory agencies still consider it safe for consumption, but growing research suggests it may not be as completely harmless in all situations. Interestingly, Carrageenan is commonly used in laboratory research to trigger inflammation in animal models when scientists want to test anti-inflammatory drugs. While that doesn't necessarily mean it causes the same effect in humans, there is evidence suggesting it could aggravate existing inflammation in the digestive tract. For example, one study in people with ulcerative colitis found that those consuming Carrageenan experienced flare-ups sooner than those avoiding it. Some research has also linked Carrageenan intake to low-grade inflammation and insulin resistance in people who are overweight, and there's even evidence suggesting that removing Carrageenan from the diet may help improve blood sugar control in some individuals. Additionally, a large observational analysis found that higher Carrageenan intake was associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. While this doesn't prove Carrageenan directly causes diabetes, it does raise questions about whether regularly consuming large amounts is as harmless as once believed. Another concern with seaweed, including sea moss, is heavy metal contamination. Sea moss, particularly species like Chondrus crispus, has a tendency to absorb and retain heavy metals from the surrounding water. Over time, contaminants such as arsenic, lead, cadmium, and mercury can accumulate inside the plant, especially if it's harvested from polluted waters. Because sea moss products are not always independently tested for heavy metals, the levels can vary widely depending on where they were sourced. first. So for people consuming sea moss regularly, especially in large amounts, heavy metal exposure is a legitimate concern. But perhaps the bigger issue for most consumers is that sea moss simply doesn't have much strong evidence behind its supposed health benefits. A lot of the hype centers around Carrageenan. While Carrageenan is technically classified as a soluble fiber, there's surprisingly little evidence showing it provides meaningful health benefits in humans. For example, some people claim sea moss can improve cholesterol levels. Most of the support for this idea is theoretical, and the few small human studies that do exist have shown only minor effects on cholesterol, with little to no improvement in other blood lipid markers. Another common claim is that sea moss helps with weight loss, but currently there are no good human studies showing that Carrageenan or sea moss leads to meaningful weight reduction. In fact, some laboratory and animal research suggests the opposite could be potentially true. Certain studies have found Carrageenan may reduce the production of GLP-1, a hormone involved in appetite regulation and blood sugar control. Since GLP-1 helps support fullness and weight management, reducing it could theoretically work against weight loss rather than helping it. A lot of the confusion likely comes from the fact that Carrageenan behaves similarly to other soluble fibers when mixed with water. Like psyllium husk or glucomannan, it forms a thick gel-like substance, so people often assume it must provide the same health benefits. But not all soluble fibers work the same way. Fibers like psyllium and glucomannan have actual clinical evidence showing they may help with appetite control, cholesterol reduction, blood sugar regulation, and digestive health. Carrageenan, despite technically being a soluble fiber too, has not consistently shown the same benefits in human research. In fact, based on some of the available evidence, it may actually have negative effects on human health. There's also growing marketing around something called overwintered or stressed sea moss. This refers to sea moss that has been exposed to harsher environmental conditions before harvest, such as colder temperatures, rougher waters, lower sunlight, or limited nutrients. The idea is that these stressful conditions force the algae to produce more protective compounds, potentially making it tougher or more nutrient dense. Some research on seaweed does suggest environmental stress can slightly change levels of antioxidants, polyphenols, minerals, and compounds like Carrageenan, but these changes depend heavily on species, season, water quality, and farming methods used. In other words, the nutritional effects are inconsistent and difficult to predict. Despite the marketing claims, there's very little solid evidence showing that overwintered sea moss provides meaningful health advantages in humans. One survey suggested people taking stressed or overwintered sea moss powder reported slightly greater improvements in fatigue and exhaustion compared to regular sea moss, but this was only a survey, not a placebo-controlled clinical trial, so the results are far from conclusive. So while stressing sea moss may slightly alter its composition, there's currently very little evidence that these changes translate into significant health benefits for the average person, especially considering that sea moss itself lacks well-established clinical benefits to begin with. Overall, sea moss has very limited evidence supporting its use for health conditions commonly associated with other fibers, such as constipation, digestive health, cholesterol management, blood sugar control, or appetite suppression. In some cases, the available research even raises concerns that it could worsen inflammation in people with inflammatory bowel disease or potentially contribute to metabolic issues like insulin resistance and diabetes. In my view, the only real advantage sea moss offers is its nutritional content, and even that benefit is fairly modest. Sea moss is mainly a source of Carrageenan, a soluble fiber with questionable health effects, along with iodine and smaller amounts of vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and plant compounds. But outside of its high Carrageenan and iodine content, there's very little nutritionally unique about sea moss that you couldn't also get from more common foods like spinach, kale, or other leafy greens. Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Yeung. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share them in the comments down below. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you know someone who could benefit from this, please share it with them. Finally, if you enjoy what we do and want to learn more, consider supporting us on Ko-fi, and be sure to check out our other socials as well.